I'm really glad when people write to me and tell me I've made a mistake. I don't know how you can write about the Regency if you don't place it in something very realistic. The historical background is always important, though, to my stories. So that would be my advice. Read her stuff, read it a lot, and get her in your head, and then write your own stories.
Hello, and welcome to another interview with a Regency author. My name's Andrew Knowles, and I and my wife run regencyhistory.net, and we are running a series of interviews with various people, including authors of historical fiction and historical non-fiction. I'm particularly talking about research and how authors go about researching the history behind their work. So today I'm interviewing G.L. Robinson, or Glynis Robinson, and Glynis, would you mind just introducing something about your books?
Yes, I will. Okay. Well, first of all, let me tell you that G.L. Robinson stands for the fact that my name is Glynis Louise, and I know that's a mouthful, but my mother, my grandmother's name was Louise, and she really wanted me to be called Louise, but my mother didn't like that name, but she did like the name Glynis, so she called me Glynis Louise, and I was always called Glynis when I was up until the age of 18, when I went to university in London. And I never liked the name Glynis, and the reason was that in boarding school, the girls used to say, they used to call me Guinness. You remember? No, you're too young. Guinness is good for you used to be the slogan. Yes. And so they used to run around saying Guinness is good for you, and that used to drive me mad. So when I went off to college, I just decided I'd call myself the second half of my name, which is Louise. So anybody who knows me since the age of 18 calls me Louise, including my husband. But anybody who knew me before the age of 18, which I must say is getting fewer and fewer these days, call me Glynis. So since that, I couldn't choose between the two of them, I made myself GL. So that's just a very boring explanation, but that's why it's GL. So you can call me Louise or you can call me Glynis. I really don't mind. I answer equally to both. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll stick with Glynis, but
okay.
but your readers obviously would know you as G.L. Robinson. That's what's on the front of your books.
Yeah, they call me GL. When they email me, they call me GL, and they must be thinking this is so weird, and it is sort of weird. So what my signature on my emails gives my whole name, and so I guess that they come back and they either use one or they use the other, whichever they feel like, which is okay. And so. You asked me to talk about my books. I have 13 Regency romances and 2 contemporary sort of crime romances out on Amazon, and I have another book coming out a Regency book coming out in February around Valentine's Day, and it's a collection of short stories actually. So that's why I started writing in 2018 when my sister, who I was in boarding school with, died. And although we'd lived for many years, because I've been in America for 40 years, so I'd lived by that time, most of my life actually, in the US. But it was, and her death was unexpected. And when I went to her funeral back in England, on the next day after her funeral, this story came into my head, because when we were in boarding school, we used to read Georgette Heyer. We used to read her, compulsively, even when we weren't supposed to, under the covers with, torches and all that stuff. So, and I don't, I'm not a fanciful person. I don't really believe in anything very much, but honestly, I think it was her telling me, write this story. So I did. I started writing and I haven't stopped. So that's why I have, as I said, 13 Regencies and 2 contemporary romances. And it's my husband out there right now. The latest one is this, which is, of course, it's going to be probably back. Oh, no, it isn't. It isn't backwards. It's called Beatrix the Baron and His Dog. And it has, as you see, a dog on the cover.
Indeed.
They're all clean Regencies in the sense that there's no sex scenes. And there's, of course, practically no violence, a little bit of sword fighting occasionally. But I try to, the historical background is always important, though, to my stories. I try to place them in a real historical year when, for example, this one is about the Baron concerned is in fact German, and he's come back from the Napoleonic Wars. It's just when Napoleon himself has been exiled to Elba, and he is now back. And I go into some, I would say a lot of detail, but there certainly is a very deliberate attempt on my part to place that in a realistic historical background. And then other ones have dealt with the Factory Acts, the attempt to pass Factory Acts, which took a very long time, as you probably know.
Yes.
And the one of my characters is very much involved in that. That's in a book called The Red-Headed Hornet. It has a red head on the front. They pretty much all have the portrait of a woman or a woman on the front.
Yes.
So that one's, and then one called Cecilia deals with women's education. And not only women's education, but actually the education of the poor in general, and talks about the school started in Portsmouth, which is where they started. They were called the Ragged Schools, I believe, something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. And they so I go into some history about that too. So in other words, I do try to have a realistic historical basis for my stories.
Excellent. That's great. Well, you've already talked about what it is that drew you to write about the Regency. And a question I often ask people at the start is would you consider your books to be historical novels or Regency romances, or what?
That's a good question. When I'm talking about them to people who don't know what Regency romance is, I always call them historical romances, right?
Yes.
I don't call them historical novels, because I think then people are expecting to read about the whole history of something or other,
right.
and I don't do that. But they truly are Regency romances with history as their basis, which I don't know how you can write about the Regency if you don't have if you don't place it in something very realistic. And so that's what I try to do. So I don't know. I guess I do one. It depends how much people know about the Regency romances. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Because it's not really a term, especially I think over here in America, maybe more than in England, people don't really recognize it because, of course, they don't know what the Regency was.
It's probably fair to say that most people in England don't really know what the Regency is, but there we are. But they understand the term in terms of Jane Austen-esque costumes and romance.
Yes, especially as recently the big thing, sorry to interrupt you, that we've had on the TV, and I don't know if it made it to England, was this series called Bridgerton. Did it come to England?
Oh yes, Bridgerton was here,
right.
and created a few waves amongst the community.
Yes, amongst the community. Some people loved it, some people hated it, and some people like me I was just glad to see it, because I was so glad to see that for once it had become mainstream. And so now, if ever you want to say to somebody says, oh, well, what type of books do you write? I say, well, they're Regency romances, like Bridgerton, I say. And they say, oh, okay. It's been a really good point. I wanted to say, I don't know where, I'm sure you do because you're a historian, but you know this book, the J.B. Priestley book, The
Prince of Pleasure. Yeah, absolutely. It's on our shelf.
Yeah.
It's on our shelf.
And I love this book. It's my Bible, really, because anything if you've forgotten or you can't quite remember the detail, he has it in here. And so if anybody of your listeners doesn't have this book, I would really, really, really recommend it. It's J.B. Priestley, as you see, and as you know, is a novelist himself.
Yes.
And he liked the Prince Regent. He's very much in favor of him, and he tends to think, and perhaps rightly, that it was more or less the politicians around him who were no good, and who therefore made his reign, if we can, he wasn't the king at the time, but that made him less than successful. That's what Priestley thinks. I don't know. I think the jury is out probably on that.
So, I mean, talking about Regency novels, how important do you think the history is to readers of these books? How much do you think they take it on board?
That's interesting because a lot of my readers email me and they say, "Oh, I really like the history in your books." So I think well, maybe there's a self-selecting group. You see, the thing is, people who don't like history, they might pick up my books and throw them away. So I can't stand that. It's got too much history in it, you know. So the people who write to me are the people who carried on reading, so they liked it. But I think most people do like to be informed a little bit, not overtly like you're standing up there with a rod like a teacher, but
Yes.
you know, they like to. I do myself, don't you? Like to learn something new when I read.
Oh, absolutely. No, I'm a big fan of historical novels. It's great. But the challenge, of course, with any historical novel is to keep the history as part of the story.
That's right, exactly. And yeah, not just, sometimes I've read them and they've sort of, you can see it's been shoved in as a sort of a bit like a, you know, two pieces of bread with a bit of peanut butter in the middle, and the history is the peanut butter in it. Well, not really, because it doesn't quite glue to either side of the bread. But yeah, no, that it is a challenge for sure.
So how do you, well, you've already given me a clue as to how you research. You talked about the book there, The Prince of Pleasure. So what else do you do to make sure that you are researching the background for the stories that you write?
Well, okay, let me tell you that I spent my whole life as an English and French teacher, a professor actually, and especially the French, I taught French history as part of one of the courses I taught was French history. So I have a lot of it in my background that I actually just know, and I don't really need to research it. But if I, and that's not to say, of course, I don't know everything, far from it. So then what I do, I just use the internet, and I've around here where I live, the libraries are rather limited, so it's not as if I could go and take out from the library something that would answer a very specific question. So I do use the internet anyway. It's much easier. And I find myself looking up a lot of things, a lot of details, like, you know, when did carriage wheels start having rubber as opposed to wood on the rims? I look it up, right? Because I want, you know, it comes in the book and I mention the wheels. I want to be able them to be exact. And especially for language, I was a language teacher and for a very long time, and I'm really into language, and I absolutely look up any word that I'm not sure was contemporary with the period. And I spent a lot of time on etymology. I really do. I think probably of all the research I do, that's the most. And it drives me mad when I read Regency books that have vocabulary that's anachronistic, that just doesn't work. And even I read one once that was talking about vitamins, how actually the plot sort of turned on these vitamin pills, and I thought, well, you know, they didn't have vitamin pills at the time. They didn't. I looked it up. I knew they didn't, but I looked it up anyway. And it seems to me that if you are writing history, in any way writing it, that you owe it to your audience to be as accurate as you can. Absolutely. So I really do.
Yeah. So some of the people watching these videos or listening to this online will be authors who are learning from the things that you and others are saying. So in terms of looking up, say, etymology online, are there particular resources that you trust? Because of course you can go online and there's a whole host of information.
Oh yeah, you have to be
careful.
How
do you know what to trust?
Well, for etymology, I use the OED.
Right.
You know, and I trust it, and I have a subscription to it, an online subscription, and so that's really easy then.
Yes.
And I think, but even if you don't have an online subscription, you can, if you want to know the etymology of a word, you type it in. I'm trying to think of one I used recently. Of course, I can't now off the top of my head, but but anyway, you type in the word and just put etymology of, and then whatever the word is, and put OED, and chances are it'll come up.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
And then you might have to, scroll down, because there's all sorts of other stuff that comes up as well. You have to be rather careful at that. But as I said, I have an academic background, so that helps me a lot, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And it's important to be thorough in the research, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Very much so. And so, more than one source, make sure you're right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Double
make
check
sure it isn't just make sure it isn't somebody's just their point of view. It's like, as I said with J.B. Priestley, I really love his book and I read it and it makes me laugh out loud. But I take him as a source, not the only source, because I know he has a point of view.
Yes, because I mean, you mentioned carriage wheels, for example. I mean, you could, if you Google carriage wheel, well, maybe not so much carriage wheels, because that's quite a niche subject. But if you look up a whole load of other much more common subjects, such as, I don't know, what do they have for dinner in the Regency, you'll find hundreds of articles on that subject. And if you only take the first one or two as being the absolute truth, then
no, it doesn't work. You have to get really good at speed reading.
Yes.
You click on the article, look at it, read it really fast, and you very soon tell whether it's valid or not, or has a good perspective. I mean, we don't really know. I mean, I was talking to you earlier about this thing I did on dining, the whole presentation, which I give when I do talks, which I do quite a few of, on dining and how it developed. And you really do have to be careful that you're saying the right thing, because chances are there's going to be somebody in your audience who's going to say, oh no, that's not right. I remember such and such, I learned such and such, and it's surprising, what happened.
Yes, and of course, all the sources that we use, at the end of the day, they're only ever going to be the point of view of the person who wrote that journal or wrote that letter,
that's what I started
or created that picture. So
yes, we don't really know, unless, I mean, you do have some contemporary sources, like Madame de Sévigné, who wrote about what people did in court, and you absolutely have that, and you can trust it. I mean, she too had a point of view, so
absolutely.
you have to filter it through that. But in terms of the factual, Madame de so-and-so wore a blue gown, that you can trust, that it was a blue gown, that it wasn't pink. But so yes, I do have a lot of fun with that. I really do like it, and I'm lucky because I can read French, so it helps a lot. Yeah,
that's a bonus. I can imagine.
It is a bonus. Yeah,
I can imagine. So let's talk a bit about this research that you've done around etiquette and around meals and that sort of thing. Are there any gems that you'd like to share with us?
Well, one thing I did find out, and perhaps I would have even come to it myself without even sort of finding it out, if I thought about it long enough, is that for the very longest time, food was just put on the table by whoever's job it was to put the food on the table. They didn't serve it at all. It wasn't actually, until the 19th century, very late 18th century, that people actually started serving the food. What they did by the end of the 18th century, they'd cottoned on to the fact that if you only put the big plate of food in front of the king or the guest of honor, chances are the people at the other end of the table wouldn't get anything to eat, which in fact is the truth, or very little. I'm sure the whole expression about being below the salt, right?
Yes.
So below the platter, you didn't get, or you got whatever was left. And they started to then put actually how can I say, dishes that would serve 3 or 4 people in front of that 3 or 4 people, and then other dishes, so that at least everybody got a chance to have some of everything.
Right.
But it was really quite late, and that sort of surprised me, the business about actually having footmen, like we saw in Downton Abbey, right? The footmen serving, or holding it so that the people serve themselves. That's really quite late in the development of table, I don't know if you call that etiquette, but just table management, perhaps, is the thing. So that was very interesting. Sorry.
So if you don't mind me interrupting, but so question there will be, how do you know that? Because that's what you've just said is very authoritative. So how can you say with confidence? How do I know it? I'm intrigued as to dig into that a little bit more.
Dig into it. Okay, so let me just find my page here where I've got this whole long thing. This, you can't see it, of course, because it's very hard to enlarge that any larger than I did. You lose it.
Yes.
But this is actually a royal wedding painted by Martin van Muytens in 1760.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at it with a loupe, which I did, you can see that the dining table, which were on two sides and
yes.
at the top, it's covered in dishes, and they're all gold dishes, but there's nobody actually serving.
Right.
And I went back to the painting on the internet. I brought it up.
Right.
And I found an article from a woman.
That would be
anyway,
interesting.
she's at the Smithsonian Museum, and she did some research on pretty much the same topic. And she had found some documents from the time where they were talking about the numbers of people and the way the place was arranged and how the food was arranged. And it turns out that the servants, their only job was to make sure that there was sufficient bread and water actually on the table to drink, and that the rest of the time the people, once the food was on the table, brought in and put on the table,
right.
It was actually considered very rude for the servants to circulate around, because it interfered with the the sort of exchange of conversation amongst the guests.
Yes.
So yeah, I did as I say, I did try to find contemporary sources for things like this.
Right. So that's one example of a source, and I'm guessing there were other exampes as well, which reinforce this.
Yes. Oh, this particular issue.
Yes.
And let me think. No, because you have to bear in mind that this PowerPoint that I did, it actually starts with, it starts with the Greeks,
right.
And it goes on through the Renaissance, and I used in this case, you see, I didn't need sources in the sense of written sources, because I had visual sources.
Yes.
And another thing I found interesting was that before the Middle Ages, and I just have these sort of pictures of Roman bacchanalia. It's very obvious that Romans ate lying down, and they did have these sort of serving wenches and so on. I just made a bit of a joke about it, that that's maybe one of the causes of the fall of the Roman Empire, is that they couldn't scramble off their beds quickly enough to do anything about it. But anyway, putting that to one side, when you get to the Middle Ages, though, to tapestries, you see that people had tables. So somewhere between the fall of the Roman Empire and the 1100, let's say, there was tables became into use. But interestingly enough, only the rich and the famous got to sit down at the table. You can see this, I think, is the Pope, and I'm sure that's French royalty there. Maybe the king, probably is the king. And the food was, again, all put on the table. I mean, it's really sort of quite interesting. And everybody else had to sort of come around and sort of help themselves, and then go off to one side and eat it. Or feed it to their dog, as you see down here. Yes. Quite interesting. And then I like this picture, truly I do, because here are these hordes of soldiers outside the palace, presumably trying to get in, but certainly not enough food for all of them. But anyway, so I did use a lot of images. A lot of research was not written so much as it was looking at images. Because the other thing we know is that the fork wasn't invented until the 17th century.
Yes.
So early pictures prior to that show people with either just eating with, well, they always ate with their hands. In this case, the woman in the middle, who I take to be the mother, is cutting the bread with the knife. She's the only one with a knife. And this guy appears to be holding I don't know, maybe a fish, I don't know, in his hand, and this one's eating a piece of bread. I come back to this in this particular presentation because, of course, it's very much the way people eat today, with their hands, without a fork, or without not a knife either. So that's why the whole presentation is called "The Wheel Has Come Full Circle," because it truly has. Right. And then I get into good old Madame de Sévigné, to Catherine de Medici, who introduced the fork in the 16th century. This is her fork. Apparently, you can actually buy reproductions of her fork, which pretty, isn't it? I like it. So isn't it amazing that it looks so much like a modern fork? The only thing is it has 3 tines, not 4. She apparently, in 1535, she was, and this comes from archives at a museum in Florence, that in 1535, in Fontainebleau, she announced to the diners that, she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, grasping the flesh from the plate with your fingers is considered intolerable in the city where I come from," which was Florence.
Yes.
So this, with that announcement, I guess she brought forth a fork, and for the first time a fork was used. So it was apparently in 1535. But even then, interestingly enough, there was only 1 fork on the table, on the main platter, and everybody could, using their knife, they cut whatever it was on the main platter, took it with the fork, but then put it in their hands. Or on their plate, but still they ate it with their hand.
Yes.
People didn't have their own fork until very much later. It's almost a century later. They didn't have their own fork. It's very interesting. So the eating with fingers actually has quite a classical history or background, right? Interesting. Then another interesting thing, the celebrity chef, after Caterina de Medici made dining a pleasurable and sociable experience in a way that it had not been before. They started having these celebrity chefs, and he came along in the 1600s. In 1671, he actually committed suicide, because on a Friday he had been awaiting fish for the king, Louis XIV, yes, and it didn't arrive. Perhaps you know this story.
No, I don't know the story. Wow.
Well, it's really very, and this is told to us by Madame de Sévigné. So this we know is true.
Yes.
Apparently, she wrote to her daughter, as she did, she always wrote to her daughter, and she told us that when the fish didn't arrive for the king's dinner, Vatel said, "I shall never survive this disgrace." And a courtier called Gourville laughed at him, and he went up to his bedchamber, put his sword against the door, and ran against it, trying to stab himself in the heart. It took 3 attempts until he did actually stab himself through the heart.
Wow.
And then pretty soon after, the fish arrived. So that's the story. Interesting, yes. Isn't it? It actually makes Gordon Ramsay seem really rather tame. And see, what else can I tell you that's interesting?
Have you got one that's specifically about the Regency? Just, I mean, this is all interesting, and we'll use it.
Yes. But... Oh well, okay. The Regency was famous by then, of course, was famous for the elaborateness, because of course it's all a development of the meals, and I couldn't find, very interesting, I couldn't find paintings of any of it. It's in the Regency, they did all those portraits of people and of with their dogs and their homes behind them, but I couldn't find people at table very much. It was not a popular subject for people at table. But hang on a minute and I'll find what I do know about it. The Napoleonic period put a crimp in it, but people in England, or nonetheless, were still, the wealthy people in England were still following the French style, which had been by this time to have these very elaborate couverts. They actually had they had 5 styles of table, apparently, in the French court. And from the le petit couvert to the grand couvert. And this one here is apparently a grand couvert. As you see, it's got all the knives and forks. It's got, in fact, it has 10, 11 different knives and forks here, and all the wine glasses. And that was adopted by diners in Britain, but I could not find pictures of it. But I did find a quote from a person who wrote a thing called Apician Morsels, or Tales of the Table, in 1829, wrote that 5 hours at the dinner table are a reasonable latitude when the company is numerous and no lack of good cheer. Because, of course, they did not that yet have people serving them at table. They had the stuff put on the table, and they served themselves. At a grand dinner, each course should have the same number of dishes. And there, a woman called Elizabeth Raffold pointed out, she wrote a book called The Experienced English Housekeeper, published in 1769, so earlier than the Regency period, but still these ideas were still perpetuated at the time. As many dishes as you had in one course, you had to have in the next. So if you had 8 different main course dishes, you had to have 8 different desserts as well. So that was to keep it standard. And then I think it's Horace Walpole wrote in and this is not a contemporary image. As I said, I couldn't find any, but I sort of like it here, because Horace Walpole wrote, "All the geniuses of the age are employed in designing new plans for dessert." And apparently they used gardens, architecture, pastoral scenes evoked in sugar, and then in porcelain, to provide a backdrop for the fruits and the sweetmeats and the jams and the jellies and the creams. This guy called William Farrington in 1756, again, it's still earlier, but it carried on. The table was prepared for dessert, which was a beautiful park. Around the edge was a plantation of flowering shrubs, and in the middle, a fine piece of water with dolphins spouting out water, and deer dispersed irregularly over the lawn. On the edge of the table was iced creams and wet and dry sweetmeats, and it was such a piece of work that it was all left on the table till we went to coffee. In other words, it was so beautiful, nobody wanted to even
nobody
touch
dared
it.
to eat it.
Nobody dared to eat it. Yeah. And so when I found this contemporary, it's obviously it's a wedding picture, but that sort of reminded me of it, with water and everything. So again, what I did find, and I said it before, is that things have come around again, and elaborateness at table is pretty much in vogue at special occasions like weddings, right? Not every day, thank goodness. But then again, the elaborate tables were, of course, not every day either. Those were for special occasions as well. So.
But one of the things that you've highlighted there, Glynis, is the importance of images, pictures, paintings.
Yes, absolutely. I use them a lot
as a historical source. And I think people need to remember that that's something that they can look at. I mean, there's cartoons as well, and the Hogarth and things like that, which help us to see how life was. I didn't think of looking at
Hogarth to see it, but of course his tables would have been, well, it would have been funny, but it would have been based on reality. I mean, no doubt, the absolute. Because, there is no doubt that the rich were incredibly self-indulgent, and at one meal would put out more food than a working person could have in a year. And it was considered quite normal. So we write about the Regency, and we write about it in a very light, I know at least I do, in a very light-hearted fashion, and I think most of us do. But there were social inequities that were absolutely scandalous and worse than they are now, and God knows they're bad now, I think. This, by the way, I thought you might be interested that menus weren't introduced until about 100 years after our friend Vattel. So in the this one, it's very hard to read the date. I can't tell whether it's 1761 or 51. Let me see.
Well, it's one or the other, isn't it? It's one or the other. 17 something anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But very interesting that the order of food is sort of like we have today. You can see that there's they start with these soups here. Yes.
And they had two specials, the grande entrée. Those are like two specials of the day, if you like.
Right, yes.
And then the regular entrees are here. And these relevés here, those are the side dishes. And it's funny, though, because one of them is a tart of whipped cream, which is really weird, considering that the next thing is roasts.
Yes.
So for us, it's weird anyway.
It is weird to us, absolutely.
Yeah, and then here again we get the petits entremets. That's the you know, the desserts and things at the end. But at least the main idea is there already.
Yes.
But that was in France, and from all I can tell, I'm not so sure that that was true in England, because certainly Georgette Hare, and although, you know, God bless her, she did a lot of research, so I think she must have been right. Whenever she describes a meal, you have sort of, I don't know, gooseberry tart served alongside cod's cheeks and lamb livers, right? I mean, they're absolutely all on the same, on the table all at the same time. It's clearly that totally mixed up type of food.
Yeah.
So I don't think that came into England and into in Regency until quite a bit later, if Georgette is anything to go by.
And it's tricky, isn't it, as an author, because you can't be an expert on all of these things. You can't be an expert on carriage wheels and table etiquette and food and a host of other things.
No, you can't. I guess all you can do is try. And so I'm going to just get rid of this. I think there we go. Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're an author too, so maybe you've had this happen to you, where I've had readers write to me and say, this is wrong, 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 wrong. You know, they didn't do this, they did that, and you know, you should know better, or something like that. And but you know, I'm really glad when people write to me and tell me I've made a mistake. Because of course, because I publish on Amazon, I can change it in 5 minutes.
Yes.
It's great. That's one thing that's really great about Amazon, is you can change your books, you know, every 24 hours pretty much. But you know, you can't know everything, and when people point out something, you know, absolutely, please do. The more the merrier. I want to know.
So you're happy about that then, which is good, because that was one of my next questions. So next question was, how do you handle criticism? But obviously it sounds like you're very welcoming of historical criticism.
I like criticism, not only historical, but any, you know. I had somebody write to me the other day saying, oh, you know, your book is rubbish. And okay. And I wrote back and I said, well, you know, thank you for telling me, you know, what particularly it was rubbish. I try to engage in a back and forth, because, you know, if somebody thinks your book is rubbish, there's probably a certain truth in that, you know. There was something there that struck them as being rubbish, or maybe several somethings. And I'd like to know what they are. Genuinely, I like to know what they are. And so, not that I'm going to change anything.
No.
But I do at least like to know what they are.
You can't please everybody all of the time.
No,
and if you know you've got a core audience, then you're writing for that core audience.
Yeah, exactly. I have a core audience, and they, you know, they know who I am, and they know what I write, and they buy my book. So
it's good.
You know, I can't complain. I'd like more people to join that group.
I mean, well, if you're willing to talk about it, what would you say was the biggest historical faux pas that you've made in a book?
I put the Congress of Vienna on the wrong date,
Right.
which was really a big mistake for me to make, because I should have known that when it was. Oh, I know. Somebody wrote to me once and said that women didn't go to funerals, and I know that's true now. I didn't at the time, and I was glad that she told me. Not that it made any difference. I didn't change my book, but because I really wanted my wife in that particular instance to walk behind her husband's funeral cortege, because I thought it was a nice image, but I found out that that was indeed true. But I nonetheless have still had women go to funerals because I want them to go. That's that. And then the other thing I found out is that apparently people got married in the morning.
Yes.
They only
they
got
did.
married in the morning.
Yes.
But that didn't suit me. So I've had quite a few weddings in the afternoon. So, it's, I feel about those things, those type of details, a bit how I feel about English grammar, which is to say, if you know grammar, you're at liberty to abuse it. If you know the history, you're at liberty to abuse it.
Yes.
But it's only if you don't know,
yes.
then that's a fault. It's an error. Then.
Yes, no, absolutely. And obviously with things like the women at funerals, I mean, there are always going to be exceptions.
Yes, absolutely.
Whatever you read or say, there would always be somebody who would be an exception to now maybe not so much weddings in the afternoons, because that was very much a church rule, I think, but it was certainly the women at funerals. Yes.
And even the weddings in the afternoons, I'm absolutely convinced if you had enough money, just like now, you can do any damn thing at any time of the day you want, right? I mean, the church has always been very open, the old handout. If you put something in the hand that's clinking money, they're going to change the rules for sure. And I'm not anti-church. I'm a churchgoer, but I recognize the value of money in all walks of society.
Yes.
Something I've always wanted to really, really, really know about, like in absolute detail, is the Vauxhall Gardens. I mention them quite a lot in my books.
Yes.
And I know, and I've read a lot about how they were set up and but still, it's all a little bit of a mystery to me. They evidently, you had these booths that you could rent, and you had this shaved ham, which was apparently the thing that you ate there. I'm sure you know that too. And this particular wine, burnt wine, I think it was, that whatever that was, I don't know. But I'm thinking, well, where was the cooking done? Where I'd really like to know these things, and I've seen those illustrations of the Vauxhall Gardens, but I've never seen where it's labeled like kitchen. And I think, where did the shaved ham come from? And then the whole business about how they had all of these lanterns in the trees, and they were gas. Well, they can't always have been gaslit, because gas didn't really come in universally until really the very end of the Regency period. So somehow, though, they seem to have some way that they lit all of these lamps and lanterns that were hanging in the trees. Everything I've read about them talks about the Vauxhall Gardens, talks about the illumination.
Yes.
So you're thinking, how did they do that? And how did they have those illusions? They had some sort of they would have illusions of, not illusion. Well, yes, illusions of let's say, Venus rising from the waves and all that type of thing. And you're thinking, well, how did they do? I'd love to, if I could go back, that's where I would go.
That's where you go.
I'd go to the Vauxhall Gardens. Forget all the dinner. I don't want that. I do want to go to the Vauxhall Gardens and wander around and just see how people did things. Yes.
So I think a lot of people would, and I think a lot of it, there has to be a lot of supposition, because we just don't know how it was done. And the lanterns thing, you just assume there must have been an army of people going around with, with tapers.
Tapers. Yes, exactly. That's what I was thinking. And that's another thing. You think of the people, the number of people it took to, for example, run a household. You might have 4 people living in the house. I mean, husband and wife and 2 children, let's say, if they were well-off people. there would be twice as many people to run the house. There'd be 4 of them and then 8, at least 8 servants, maybe 12.
Yes.
Because they had to have people to carry the coal or the wood, whichever, upstairs for the fires. They had to have people carry the water up so you could have a bath. They used to have people to do everything, things that now we don't even think about as being a job anymore.
Yes, absolutely.
They had people employed, and it kept that whole those echelons of society employed.
So a final question for you before, as we're wrapping up, is you're speaking to somebody else who wants to write Regency romances, historical fiction. What would your tip be, or tips? What advice would you give to somebody setting out on this?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. A very good question. What would my tip be? I think you do need to read all of Georgette Hare. Just read all of her books, absolutely non-stop, and then go back to the beginning and read them all again. And then your head will be so full of it that you'll be able to write it. I really do think I've read her seriously. I told you, in boarding school, I went to boarding school when I was 12 and my sister was 10. And we read them, and I'm 75, and I have read Georgette Hare every year of my life.
Really?
So I have. I reread her books compulsively. I know exactly what's going to happen. I even know what people are going to say to each other, but it doesn't matter. I like her books so much. And furthermore, I find that if I get her in my head, I get the right tone.
Yes.
Because to me, it's very important in Regency to not take yourself too seriously. As we've already discussed today, we don't really know what life was like. We can surmise it. We can try and find out from reading contemporary accounts. And the whole aspect of life being very difficult for at least 50% of the population, and people dying of very minor illnesses, women dying in childbirth very, very often, very high rate.
Yes.
All of those things, we have to push that to the back of our mind, or else we can't write these. Right. So we have to really deal with it with a light hand. And that's what good old Georgette was great at. So that would be my advice. Read her stuff, read it a lot, and get her in your head, and then write your own stories.
So read Georgette Hare over and over.
Seriously, I have been reading them for at least 60 years. Every year I read 1 or 2 of them. Or sometimes when talking of sources, when I'm writing my own, I suddenly think, wait a minute, what did she say in Arabella? Wait a minute, what did she say about that club on was it on Brook Street or Jermyn Street? Where was it? I look it up in her books. Because she's pretty accurate. She wasn't accurate about everything. She does make mistakes.
She has made a few mistakes, absolutely.
She made a few mistakes, but things like that she was good on.
Excellent. Oh, that's good. Well, that's good advice to finish with. So, well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Glynis. Thank you for sharing. We could have talked for a lot longer, but hopefully anybody who's watching this, listening to this, has picked up some great tips about how they can approach research, and particularly the stuff around using images and reading Georgette Hare over and over.
Yeah, definitely use images. Yeah. So anybody who'd like to contact me, please do. It's just glrobinsonauthor@gmail.com. Just put in the word author, glrobinsonauthor@gmail.com, and please contact me anytime with questions or criticisms or comments.
Excellent. And they can find you online. You've got a website?
I have a website, and that's Romance Novels by G.L. Robinson. Romance Novels by glrobinson.com. And
your social media?
And I'm on. And yes, I'm on all the social media. I suppose I should have done. You see how good I am at all this self-promotion.
That's right. I'll pop stuff on. I'll pop stuff on the screen. Don't worry. So
okay, I do. I'm on all the social media, even TikTok. My granddaughters taught me how to do TikTok. And I tell you, I love making those videos. That is just the best fun. It doesn't sell a single book. Not for me, it doesn't. So when I have a big blitz on TikTok, I maybe find that I sell, I don't know, in a week. Maybe I'll sell 3 more books than I did before, you know, but not very much. But for its own sake, I love making the videos.
Excellent. I'll have to look those up. I've not seen your videos on TikTok.
Oh, well, you can see they're very good. They're excellent.
We'll take a look. Well, as I said, thank you very much, and all the best for the rest of your day. You've got a lot of snow there. You showed us the snow pictures earlier on.
Yes.
So yeah, hopefully,
and you too, and Merry Christmas. And
yes, and
I'm so envious because, of course, we don't have mince pies over here. We don't have Christmas pudding over here.
No mince pies. I didn't realize that.
Oh, no. Well, we do have a thing called a mince tart, although it's not associated particularly with Christmas. It's more like Thanksgiving, actually.
Right.
But the mince over here is much sweeter than it is in England, and it's an open-faced tart, and it just doesn't do the job.
Not the same. Well,
no.
Anyway, thank you very much for talking to me today.
Thank you very much. Nice to talk to you. Bye-bye.